I'd like to extend a special thanks to one of the few sponsors who have supported us through every green building festival since we started. I'd like to ask Inline Fiberglass, Gary Mackin, product and architecture consultant with Inline, to come up and say a few words. Gary.
Good day, everybody. I'm here today representing the Inline company, along with my associate, Mr. Victor Kowalczyk. Victor, if you're in the room, stand up and take a bow. So, Inline is a medium-sized company, family-owned for 42 years, and it is a wholly owned Canadian company located in Etobicoke. Currently doing business on a number of continents, it is the only fully integrated fiberglass lineal producer in Canada. The company manufactures fiberglass reinforced polymer lineals for the production and fabrication of total window and door systems. These engineered products are designed to lend excellent thermal efficiencies to the frame and window, as well as performing good resistance to air and water penetration in any environment. These are the characteristic physical parameters which lead to compliance with design specifications for adherence to current codes. These products are models of performance which complement the aspirations of this foundation, which applied to the building envelope for the specific purpose of sustainability and durability. Inline is pleased to take part in this event as a sponsor. I'd just like to say a couple of words about net zero energy. Inline Company now is working with a company called Delridge Homes on mid-rise, 6-story buildings, condominiums, and those 3 are net zero. We also are doing some work with another project called Zero Net House Perfect in collaboration with Endeavour from Peterborough and Ryerson University, Toronto. It's now on exhibit at 21 Don Roadway it'll be there till October the 8th. We also have another one at Van de Waal House in Edmonton, Alberta. Thank you.
Gary, thank you very much, and thank you to Inline for your continued support and your great work. Our first speaker for this afternoon's session is Bryn Davidson, co-owner of Lanefab Design Build of Vancouver, and he's going to be speaking on Laneway housing. Bryan, come on up.
Hi, I'm Bryn. I run the design half of our little design build team. It's a partnership between myself and my business partner, Matt Turner, who's a general contractor. I want to chat about our experience, which is started off building laneway houses in the city of Vancouver, and from there how we kind of slipped sort of accidentally almost into doing passive house projects. And then from there, how wrestling with urban infill in a city like Vancouver, where it can be quite a challenge to do pretty much anything, led us to start thinking differently about what it means to do a green building, and to take on a slightly different approach to what we would call net positive development. But first, it's just after coffee break. It's late in the afternoon. So everybody stand up and just stretch for a second. Come on. Yeah, 4 o'clock. Good job. Oh, there we go. All right. I know what it's like existing on lots of coffee. Has anybody here actually been in a laneway house? We've got a couple. Or anybody who's not from Vancouver who's been in a laneway house? Okay, a couple of folks. All right. So, start off with laneway houses. The story of our company begins in crisis. Back in 2008, during the global financial crisis, I went from having a year's worth of work to having no work in the span of about a week. And so in early 2009, we were kind of sitting around, and my wife was asking me to get a real job. At the time, I started chatting with Matt, my now business partner, about opportunities and what the city of Vancouver was talking about for this Laneway House thing. It seemed like they were creating a new market almost out of thin air, and there was an opportunity to sort of brand around this. So we jumped in, created our company, started handing out flyers at open houses, that kind of thing. And in 2010, we built the city's first Laneway House. So this is 700 square feet. It's built at the rear. You can see the main house there in the background. 2 bedrooms downstairs and living space upstairs. At the time, nobody really knew what they were doing. Nobody knew what this was. This is what it looks like from above. The built fabric in Vancouver consists of a lot of these single-family homes with these garages at the back. And the Laneway House rules were written such that the Laneway House would fit more or less in the same kind of footprint as those existing garages. So you can see it's not really that much difference when you zoom out from above. That first open house drew a lot of interest. So we had 2 days of open houses with a line around the block. About over 1,000 people came through because people were so curious about this new form of housing in a city where there is no vacant land. So we kept motoring ahead from there. We started doing a whole bunch of different Laneway houses. In the beginning, the city gave us extra square footage for a garage. So we would do these kind of fake garages that were fully insulated with drywall. The city then changed that rules and gave us more living space and put the car outside, which was a good, sensible strategy. The rules say that the upper floor can only be 60% as big as the lower floor, and you have to face towards the lane. You can't look in your neighbor's backyard. So we start to be quite generative in terms of the form of these things from the zoning. Projects like this, we can get a bit of sunshine. We can get close to net zero on the Laneway House. Projects like this, we had to kind of go to the Board of Variance to relax it so that we can save that magnolia tree. What we found is that we thought we'd do really standardized projects, but in the end, they've pretty much all ended up being custom. The sites, the zoning, everything is so unique that it really made sense to do a custom approach. We're doing sort of more industrial type stuff. A lot of it is extended family situations. So we've got couples building on their parents' property. The yard becomes this kind of shared courtyard space. A lot of them are multiple bedrooms. In this case, it's sort of a live-work loft for somebody working at home. This is a lot. This is a 940 square foot Laneway house on a large lot. The large lot gave us the freedom to kind of spread out and try some different ideas in terms of the design. And we're building everything in there. We're building, the house. We're doing the design work. We're building the furniture. We can do some odd things. This is about a 600 square foot Laneway house, and that's a jacuzzi tub built into the dining room floor. Just threw it out on a whim, and the clients were like, sure. We're like, okay. So the idea being that it's closed most of the time, but every once in a while, if you want to open that up, it's kind of in this sort of indoor-outdoor space. But kind of fun ways to experiment with these little dwellings. Some of them were pushing the kind of boundaries of sort of net zero, putting solar panels, those kind of things, but really always working within the constraints of what the city has given us. Some of these, again, we're doing some work on the main house to try and tie it together with the Laneway house. In this case, we can see a project that was designed under the original rules, with a garage, but then they let us subsequently convert that garage into a home office and a second bedroom. So this is really our typical client, and this is who we're building for. It's the young couple, maybe with a kid. They're looking at the prices of condos in Vancouver, and they're realizing that it's just kind of crazy. And so if they're lucky enough to have parents with land, they can build a really nice Laneway house for about half the price of buying a condo in the city. And so this has spurred this really sort of strong demand for these kind of custom projects. So from here, from Laneway House, from the beginning, we were always interested in having a green building approach that we could do on every single project. We didn't want to do 8 code minimum projects and then 1 green one when we can convince some crazy client to just upgrade the windows or something. We wanted a standardized package that would go all the way through all of our projects. Now, we branded the company partly with the name Fab to deal with the fact that we were using these prefab panels. The great thing about that is when people came to us, they expected us to do something different. And so when we told them that our walls are 13 inches thick, they were like, okay. And so whether they asked for it or not, that's what we do. So this is our very first Laneway house, 10-inch thick structural insulated panel, LED lighting, triple glazed windows. This has become our default package for, I don't know, 80 plus homes that we've built over the last several years. And so what I'm trying to get at is that we were coming up with our own systems, but as we were going through this, you know, we're doing triple glazed windows mounted in a thick wall. We get these deep exterior window reveals, which really become kind of a signature part of the way our buildings look. We started developing a 2-part wall system because with a little tiny laneway house, we needed to run plumbing and other services on the outside walls. We've got continuous insulation running under the slab and up the inside. What we found is all of a sudden we were starting to drift almost inadvertently towards doing something similar to Passive House. So we started going to conferences and learning about this Passive House system. Now this Passive House, like LEED or whatever, is a sort of a certification system. It was developed in Germany based on Canadian ideas. And we started sort of embracing this and saying, really, this is not that different than what we're doing. It just happens to have a lot more intellectual rigor behind it versus us. We're over here just kind of doing whatever the hell we think we're doing. I don't know what we're doing. But this is sort of evolving as we're going forward. So in this project, we started using a plugin for SketchUp called Design PH, which lets you do Passive House energy modeling in 3D in real time. So this is a really cool tool where you can stretch windows bigger, make the house change the R values, and see right away how that impacts your energy demand. And so from that, we started to build, like this house was a spec house, and now with this house, yeah, we're designing the Passive Houses in Vancouver with 17-inch thick walls, triple glazed windows. We had a client approach us. He had designed this suburban house and he wanted us to make it a Passive House. So we worked with him to redesign the assemblies and the systems. We've got about R100 in that roof up there. The other piece we're doing is to get to really high levels of air tightness. So this house was about 0.4 air changes per hour. To be a Passive House, you've got to be about minimum 0.6 air changes or maximum 0.6 air changes. So a really high level of air tightness. And all of this work with Passive House is around trying to achieve these really rigorous energy targets. And to do that, we're using this big monster of a spreadsheet called the PHPP. Has anybody here used that? Yeah, you're familiar with that. So it's this big old thing. And part of the reason why Passive House does such a good job of delivering performance that actually matches the modeling is that the PHPP is so rigorous. But there's these targets here in terms of energy per square meter that when you're first starting with Passive House seem totally arbitrary. And you're like, why the hell did they come up with these numbers? Like, why isn't there Passive House Silver and Passive House Gold and Passive House Platinum? You know, why can't I just do a kind of Passive House? And you think, oh, these Germans are just being super uptight or whatever. Eventually you come to realize, and after enough conferences, it sort of sinks in, that within this spectrum of kind of cost-benefit analysis, as we're increasing the energy efficiency beyond code, a lot of times the cost is also going up because we're getting better windows or whatever it is and some kind of ROI. But there's a discontinuity in this curve kind of partway through. And that's right where you're able to suddenly, you've gotten enough insulation, it's airtight enough that you can heat or cool the house using just the ventilation air. And what that means is all of a sudden you can take out the central heating system. You can get rid of the boiler, you can get rid of the natural gas service, you can get rid of your concrete toppings for your in-floor heat. There's a variety of things that can come out of the cost because you've reached this kind of tipping point. And this is exactly where those Passive House targets come from. And so I started to become much more willing to engage with the system once I understood that there was this kind of thinking. And it's not about greenness, it's really an economic argument about why we do these super efficient buildings to this level and not beyond. So from there, with our practice, we realized that this was very much in line with what we wanted to do. So we've moved towards making passive house our default standard for new full-size homes. It's quite difficult with laneway houses because they're little, and passive house doesn't let you cheat. So a laneway house is a very inefficient building form. So we're doing kind of our own version with the laneway houses, but with the full-size houses, we're shifting towards passive house. So this is another project we're just starting construction on. It's 2 passive houses in the front and 2 net zero laneway houses in the rear. This is another one that's in for permit, a passive house with a laneway house. This has a basement suite. A lot of western exposure, so we've built exterior roll shades into this kind of awning element because we're trying to get a lot of sun when we can, but not too much sun. This is a passive house and laneway house we're working on a very difficult east-west lot. Difficult because that house next door is taking up all of our sun. That illegal rooftop cover that they have on their roof deck is taking about 1.5 kilowatts out of our target. So these are the challenges we face working in the city compared to some idealized situation out in the country. This is a passive house duplex that we're working on in San Francisco. The climate there is so benign that actually our standard laneway house package works as passive house. It's just a benign climate. So it's quite easy. We can be much more articulated with the architecture. So from here, that's the kind of arc of our work. We've done a lot of laneway houses. We're now moving more and more towards doing full-size passive house. But what we started to get at was that there was some missing pieces from how we felt people were talking about green buildings. And part of that is that at a lot of times we end up focusing on these very little details. And maybe some people in the room here can tell me what the psi value of that installation is. The size, the thermal bridge value based on where you put the window. Passive house is full of this kind of micromanagement of tiny little details. And we sometimes forget to kind of step back and think about how that fits into the big picture. So, of course, I've got the sort of cliche polar bear talking about climate change to represent the fact there's these spectrums from the micro details to thinking about it at a big picture level. Now, one of my frustrations is that for years and years and years when we talked about passive house or green homes or net zero or whatever, you punch in a search, this is what you get. You get this nice house on the hill, sort of perfectly oriented for the sunshine, you know. It's great. It's got a really good envelope in a lot of cases, really great windows. Maybe it's like a passive house and is very envelope-centric. In other cases, maybe it's focused more on the technology, the green bling. If you put enough solar on it, maybe the house is good, maybe it's not, but you can put this green technology and you can kind of attach it. And a lot of the discussion around how good is your home or how green is your home came down to these bits about the envelope or the technology. But the problem is that there are some pieces missing from this conversation that start to mean that the targets that we set for green building are kind of sometimes leading us in the wrong direction. So what we're trying to do is bring about a sort of shift in the way of thinking, a shift away from focusing just on the artifact to saying what is the story of that artifact and the impact that it has on the world. So instead of saying, you know, not just how good is your building, but did this project, this house actually make the world better? And we want to not just be fuzzy about that, like, oh, we made it better, okay. We want to actually measure it, look at what was before, what was after, and say, did this house make the world better? So to get at those pieces, I just want to go through an example. Maybe some of you guys know this house. This is Amory Lovin's house in Colorado. It was built in the 80s. Really an iconic piece of green building that influenced myself and I think many other people of our generation. In the middle of winter, Amory can grow bananas in his atrium. You know, it heats itself. You know, it's this sort of icon of zero impact living. And it's fantastic in a lot of ways. It's got a lot of interesting things. But there's something missing that you don't ever see in the pictures of Amory's house. And that's the parking lot. Because this house is out in the middle of nowhere. And you got to drive there. And if you live there, you got to drive. If you want to get a loaf of bread, you got to drive. If you want to do anything, you got to drive. So we don't see that because we don't talk about that as part of the story of this building. And it just drives me freaking crazy because, you know, here I am like struggling against the zoning bylaws, working in a dense city trying to do infill, and it's a pain in the ass, frankly. But, you know, with the impact of location is profound. So let's take a net zero home and let's put it in two different places in the region. In one area, you can bike, you can walk. In another location, you've got to drive. Everybody in your house has to drive. Maybe you've got 5 cars out in the driveway. So the exact same building, but two profoundly different ecological and climate footprints for those families, even with the exact same building. And a good way to kind of capture this is looking at the walk score. It's such an easy, simple tool to kind of get sort of a grasp of the walkability of a location. So in one location you can drive, and another location you can actually walk. And this starts to become profound in terms of how we compare the types of projects, where do we spend our green building dollar. Because you might be better off in this drafty old house in a walkable location than building your net zero house out somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And this is, once we start thinking about transportation impacts as part and parcel of that project, it changes the conversation. So if we look at Amory's house, it uses just a fraction of the energy on an ongoing basis compared to a typical house. But when you look at it, the real impact also includes the impacts of transportation. So I'm giving you this little icon just saying where is it located, because this is one of the missing pieces that's whenever we see an article about a green building, about a new net zero project or whatever, it's often forgotten and we need to start to include it. So there's one more piece, another missing element, which is talking about not just the building, but what came before it. Because this was built on a greenfield site somewhere in the middle of nowhere. There was squirrels and beavers and other kind of things. I don't think they were burning any fossil fuels at the time. So, you know, we went from a state before to a state now, and that's the cumulative impact of that building, looking at it from before to after. So let's look at it differently. If that building had replaced an old house, the story would be fundamentally different. The impact of that project on the climate would be fundamentally different if it had either renovated or replaced an old climate hog that was just burning fossil fuels and spewing it out in the atmosphere. So this is the thing. The artifact is one thing, but the story of it can be very different based on some of these choices. So in this case, we've got one where it's a good green building, the other where we've gone beyond just being green and we've actually had a net positive impact. We've actually reduced the real greenhouse gas emissions going out into the atmosphere. So this other piece is saying, what does it replace? And this is another thing that we rarely hear about when we talk about green buildings. So the stuff we always hear about, the building envelope, the green bling, the technology, all that kind of stuff, great. But also, where is it located? What does it replace? And these start to be the 3 questions that I start to look at every project through. Now, in terms of how this all fits together, all of us here are involved in kind of these sort of leading projects where we are sort of opinion leaders. And what we are doing with our green building projects are then influencing the building code, which is then influencing the code minimum buildings, which then becomes the building stock of the future. So we have this whole mass of existing buildings, and what we're doing at the top really is critical because it points the direction for everyone else to go that way. So when we're doing a lead project, we are doing something that's great. It's transforming the industry. a lot of those LEED standards have then been adopted into code, and we get this steady turnover of the fleet of buildings. And above that, we have these class of buildings that are really aspirational, that are trying to be zero impact. They're trying to bring the impact of that building down almost to nothing. And we're starting to see Passive House, the Living Building Challenge, again starting to influence LEED, and it's trickling down. And I think that's all great, but we've started to grasp that if we want to address the climate crisis, we really need to start going beyond, and that means going beyond zero impact to projects that actually make the world measurably better. And that's what I would call a net positive project. You're looking at it before, you're looking at it after, you're saying, do I make the world better? We're asking not just how good is your building, where is it located, what does it replace? The Lovins House, great building, greenfield site, walk score of 0. If they wanted to be net positive, they'd have to throw a whole lot of solar to offset the transportation. This is fundamentally different. This is a Passive House retrofit in Brooklyn. So that's the heat map, the heat photo, showing the transformation. This is much like the energy sprung stuff earlier. The transformation of this building from an energy pig to one that saves energy. At a walk score of 100, we've added space while reducing the total climate impact. This is a substantially net positive project. So I want this to be the new face of green building when we think about what a green building is and what a net positive project can be. In Vancouver, we're combining Passive House main units with Laneway houses. The goal is that those new units use less energy than the old building that they replace. And they do it in a place that's more walkable than the regional average. And if we can combine that into a better housing form, it gets even better. This is a Passive House sixplex in Victoria, BC. This is a great type of thing. If we can do Passive House multifamily in walkable neighborhoods, I think a lot of our climate crisis is starting to be addressed. The Bullitt Center, you guys know this. I don't think it's great because of the crazy solar hat. I think it's great because they picked a site that was a walk score of 100. So different than so many other sort of corporate strategies. In Vancouver, we're seeing an explosion of Passive House projects. Cornerstone Architecture has a whole bunch of these Passive House multifamily projects going in. This is one in Portland, the Kiln Project. And this is a high-rise Passive House in New York. And then just two days ago, they announced 2 towers going into Vancouver, 43 and 48 stories, to be built to the Passive House standard in downtown Vancouver. So we're starting to see a real transformation in the thinking of Passive House away from the house part to really urban, interesting, dense projects. And if you live somewhere rural, that's fine. Find an old house and make it better. So these are the 3 questions, and I think this really gets at the fact that we can't stop just looking at the buildings. We need to look at our zoning policy, our urban infill policy, and we also need to look at this swath of existing buildings, because those existing buildings are actually gold mines of potential carbon reduction, just kind of waiting to be captured. So as much as that greenfield site up on the hill is so tempting from a design point of view, it's really not the future of where we need to go as designers. So I think I am just about out of time. I do have a couple of slides on zoning policy for Laneway House if people were really interested in that, but otherwise I'm happy to keep motoring ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Bryn. I think we've got a couple of minutes. We can take some questions.
Sure.
If that's okay with you.
Sure.
We're going to take a couple of minutes to take a couple of questions. If there's anything for Bryn first. Oh, we got one over here for you.
Hi. So I just have a question regarding the Brooklyn retrofit. So Barry had a very interesting presentation on the modular retrofit we can do on social housing. Can you just elaborate a little bit on what you did in that scenario and what you have done on top of the envelope to make it passive housing standard?
Okay, so first thing, that wasn't one of our projects. That was a group called Fabrica 718, I believe, out of New York. And they did a lot of really interesting things in terms of over-insulating the outside of the building. There's a lot of folks in New York doing really interesting passive house retrofits, but it's quite different than the stuff we're doing in Vancouver. Because Vancouver, the buildings are very different. It's all wood frame with setbacks.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks.